Good morning. It's good to see this number out. So thankful to be able to come together to study God's Word, to worship God this morning. Good to have Ken and Sue back with us from their adventures across the pond. All right, so before we continue with Lesson 3, picking up in Joshua chapter 14, that's where we'll be starting here in just a moment, but let's go through the 17 time periods before we do that. So before the flood, scattering of the people, the patriarchs, the Exodus, invasion and conquest, the judges, the united kingdom, the divided kingdom, Judah alone, the captivity, return from captivity, the years of silence, the life of Christ, the early church, and the letters to the Christians. All right. Sorry, the clicker's not responsive. So again, make sure that you're looking over those, and we'll have a quiz on those at some point throughout the quarter. So today we'll get into Lesson 4, which it seems crazy that just 3 weeks ago we started in the book of Joshua and the invasion and conquest, and by the end of Lesson 4 we'll already be through the book of Joshua. So we've already studied Joshua chapter 4 through 8 with the central campaign, the southern campaign, chapter 9 through 10, the northern campaign, chapter 11, the list of kings conquered, chapter 12, and then lesson 3 that we're in right now, of course, is talking about the land being divided, chapters 13 through 19, the cities given to priests and the Levites, the cities of refuge, in chapters 20 and 21, and then lesson 4 we'll pick up with the Transjordanic tribes returning home, chapter 22, Joshua challenged Israel in chapter 23, and then the covenant renewed at Shechem in chapter 24. So we'll get into lesson 4 with the end of the book of Joshua, and then we'll immediately go into the book of Judges. Of course, the Judges being discussed there, Othniel through Samson. We'll talk about the story of Ruth, which does take place during the time of the Judges, and then we'll end with discussing Eli and Samuel over in 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 9, and that takes us up to Saul, of course, is appointed as king, beginning the united kingdom. All right, so if you would turn over to Joshua chapter 14, and one of the things that we obviously focus on in the book of Joshua is, of course, Joshua, but one of the other primary faithful people from the wandering in the wilderness, even before that, of course, is Caleb. And although I think that Joshua may be my favorite Bible character, Caleb's going to be a pretty close second to how faithful he was. And so I'd like for us to read Joshua chapter 14, verses 6 through 15 before we answer the question. So I say in Joshua chapter 14, verses 6 through 15, we read Caleb's request of Joshua and his inheritance given. And then considering Numbers 14, 24, 32, 12, and then also Deuteronomy 1, verse 36, what made his request and inheritance possible. So Joshua chapter 14, we'll begin in verse 6. We'll start over here with Daddy, and if we would just take a verse apiece and work our way back.
Then the children of Judah came to Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, "You know the word which the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea."
I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again, as it was in my heart.
Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt with fear, but I followed the Lord my God fully.
So Moses swore on that day, saying, "Surely the land where your foot has trodden shall be your inheritance and your children's forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God."
And now behold, the Lord has kept me alive. As he said, these 45 years, ever since the Lord spoke the word to Moses, while Israel was wandering in the wilderness. And now here I am this day, 85 years old.
What verse is next?
Verse 11.
Okay. Now then he gave me this hill country you heard on that day, then Anakim was there, with great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out as the Lord has spoken.
Now therefore give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke in that day, for you heard in that day how the Anakim were there, and that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said.
And Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb the son of Jephunneh as an inheritance.
Go ahead, Todd, for 14.
Therefore Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite until this day, because he followed the Lord God of Israel fully.
Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba, for Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. Then the land had rest from war.
I think we may have skipped 11, so that's one I want us to catch. Verse 11, I am still as strong today as I was in the day Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so my strength is now for war and for going out and coming in. And he's making that statement again, but when he went to spy out the land, he was 40. He's now 85, and he's making that statement. Numbers 14:24 says, but my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land which he entered, and the descendants shall take possession of it. Chapter 32, verses 11 and 12 of Numbers. None of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, for they did not follow me fully, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, and Joshua the son of Nun, for they have followed the Lord fully. And then Deuteronomy 1:34 and 36, then the Lord heard the sound of your words, and he was angry and took an oath, saying, not one of these men, this evil generation, shall see the good land which I swore to give to your fathers, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh. He shall see it, and to him and to his sons I will give the land on which he has set foot, because he has followed the Lord fully. All right, what made his request and inheritance possible?
The Lord fully.
Hey, if you can't figure out the answer to that question, then we got some problems. One of the things I love, besides the fact that how emphatic it is that he followed the Lord fully, is there in Numbers what it said he had a different spirit. So thinking about that, a different spirit that Caleb had from everybody else, well, what's the different spirit?
Faith.
Faith? Norm?
It was that spirit that he was going to follow the Lord. Whatever the Lord said, when something is repeated over and over and over again, you know it's important. The word fully, you can't miss it.
Sam?
I feel terrible not knowing the verse, but what's the New Testament verse about God not giving us a spirit of timidity and fear?
2 Timothy 1:7.
That's what this reminds me of. Didn't have a spirit of timidity.
Yeah. Which obviously you can go all the way back to Numbers chapter 13 and 14 and see the different spirit that Caleb had from everybody else. And I think April said faith, or somebody said faith. And his wasn't, he wasn't unbelieving. He was believing in everything. He was obedient in everything. He had his full trust in God. He fully followed Jehovah. He fulfilled to walk behind Jehovah, regardless of what the situation was. And that gave him a different spirit than everybody else. Norm?
Well, it was interesting, too, that he didn't just pick the good land or whatever. He wanted the toughest land to take, the one with the giants in it.
All right, so what does that tell us?
A different feeling to that word fully as to what full obedience means. It's not just doing the requirement, it's putting all that you have into it.
Okay, and we'll talk about that just a little bit more in our next lesson, but just notice how many times we're told that Caleb wholly follows the Lord, even just here in Joshua. So in chapter 8, in the face of all the people turning against the Lord and wanting to go back to Israel, Caleb says, yet I wholly follow the Lord my God. So when he's saying that, you think he's speaking arrogantly? Puffing his chest up to Joshua and be like, I wholly follow the Lord. I deserve what? No, it's just a statement of fact. Like the people were unbelieving, I was believing, I wholly followed the Lord. But it wasn't just Caleb, because in the very next verse, Caleb recalls that Moses uses these same words, and Moses is saying this about Joshua. And then God said the very words himself when the decree was given that Israel would not enter Canaan for his disobedience. So God himself is saying of Caleb, he wholly followed the Lord. But just think about the time and place that Caleb is in right now, especially when he's 40 years old. So he's wholly following the Lord when there's only one other person that seems to be wholly following the Lord, and we're talking about the whole nation. How hard is it to wholly follow the Lord when you feel like, and you truthfully are, one of the only ones that's wholly following the Lord? And yet he didn't lose heart. And then think about it from the perspective of, I was ready to go in. And now because of y'all, I got to sit here and wander for 40 years. And yet, what does he do? He continues to wholly follow the Lord. He wasn't making excuses. Again, just the time and place that he is in, and he's wholly following the Lord, is such an encouragement, and it should be to us, that regardless of what we have going on around us, and regardless of what everybody else is saying or doing, we should wholly follow the Lord. So let me get Sam, and then Jesse, and then Francis.
He doesn't consider his service over, I guess, once this is accomplished. It's still continual. And it's interesting that there's this relationship between him getting what you can consider his reward for wholly following the Lord, and how that directly relates to him continually serving him. And I also think it's interesting in verse 11 he mentions how cool and fit he is being 85 years old. That's obviously really cool. But then in verse 12, when he talks about settling there, he says, perhaps the Lord will be with me and I can drive them out. So he still isn't he's still wholly relying on him there as well. He's not relying on himself. You might think that in verse 11, but he's still totally pointed toward God in that way.
Yes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too.
The next question. Jesse?
603,550. 2 men out of that number remain faithful. That's the original numbering of the 20 years and above of the fighting men. 603,550. Just 2 out of that, which is a lot of lessons from that.
Yeah. If we're the only one, we have to maintain our faith and our trust and continue to wholly follow the Lord. Francis?
I can only imagine how much faith and how much prayer and how much belief he had each and every day of all those years to be as strong as he was. He had the patience, but you know how we get our patience. You go through trials. So he was always dependent and always knew what God said would be. It's like us today. In whatever our situations are, God is in control. It may not be what we want as we see it, but God knows more than we know.
Absolutely. So, go ahead, Norm.
Here am I, send me. For him, it seems as if the service was part of the reward that he was getting, the privilege of being able to serve God no matter what.
Yeah. So question 3 and question 4, they obviously go together. I didn't want to have one super really long question, so I broke it up into 2, but it is still discussing what we already are discussing in verses 11 and 12. So I say, consider Caleb's age, and specifically what he says in verses 11 and 12, and the difficulty of the land he requests. What does this teach us, and how can we make application to our lives? What made Caleb victorious? And to me, this is similar to what we talked about last week with Joshua and his age. But again, verses 11 and 12, it says, I am still as strong today as I was in the day Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so my strength is now for war and for going out and coming in. Now then, give me this hill country about which the Lord spoke of on that day. For you heard on that day that Anakim were there with great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I will drive them out as the Lord has spoken. So Caleb doesn't say, all right, I'm 85. It's time to hang up the boots. Time to hang up my sandals. It's time to let the younger ones come and take over. It's time for me to retire from serving the Lord. He doesn't say that he's 85 years old and he just really needs to rest. He needs to take a break. Now, I've never seen anybody as physically strong at 85 as they were at 40. But how do you think, what specifically is his strength still right now? Lena?
His faith. He says basically same words that David will say later when he's going to fight Goliath. The Lord is with me, and I will conquer the cities that are great and fortified.
So again, think about from the time that he's 40 to 85 now. So he's wandered the wilderness. He's now had these years of battling in the promised land, obviously with the Lord's help. But he is just as strong in his fervor and in his love for the Lord at 85 as he was at 40. He has just as much fire, or what's another word? Zeal for the Lord at 85 as he did at 40. And again, I'm closer to the 40 than I am the 85, but I hope that when I'm 85, if I make it that long, that I can have just as much faith and zeal as I do at almost 44. And I think that oftentimes it may be just the opposite, and some of it may be because of our own abilities. Maybe we don't have, and we shouldn't have the same abilities at 85 as we do at 40. And so when we lose certain physical abilities, sometimes we can feel like, well, we're not as useful for the Lord. Caleb didn't seem to have that problem at all. He knew that he could still be useful. Why? Because he had the Lord. The Lord's not going to change, regardless of how old we are. He's going to continue to be the Lord, and he's going to continue to be able to do everything that he's able to do, and we just have to maintain our faith. I think about Jesus' criticism of the church at Ephesus over in Revelation chapter 2, that they had lost the love that they had at first. Caleb had not lost his love for the Lord, not one bit. And so I think one of the things that we have to see is age is not a factor in faith. It cannot be a factor in our faith. We cannot use age as an excuse to not do things. And another thing, and Norm pointed this out when we were talking about lesson 3, we don't need to be looking for the easy ground. Again, at Caleb's age and the things that he had seen, and he still knows that the Lord is with him, he's like, give me the high ground, give me the giants. I don't care. Give me this difficult path because the Lord's going to be with me and I'm going to be able to accomplish whatever. So those of you that are older than me, don't lose your faith. Don't lose your zeal for the Lord. Anything else on number 4? I love Caleb. All right, number 5. In a society where immediate rewards are expected, how can we learn from Caleb's patience in waiting for God's promise is to be fulfilled? Norm?
Well, again, I get the sense that it's not part of the reward was in the service part of it. And if like Paul, if you consider the work to be the reward, then you are, and as a result of that gives you the zeal to work every day, because working is a reward. The benefits that come at the end are just the icing on the cake. It's not the reward. That's the icing. The reward is in the doing and the serving, and that would give you a mindset then of service, and that gives you the joy, because it's in the service that's there, and that's how you get joy in your life every day, no matter what the circumstances. And so that's how I see Caleb. I love Caleb too.
Norm P.
Despite the decades of work that he put in on the front side, whether they were joyful or arduous and mournful, he never doubted that he would get it. And that again is an elevation of his faith. And that despite the decades that wandered by, despite all the people he knew growing up dying, he still knew he would get his reward. And he knew that the way to get his reward was to continue to be faithful to his God. And at 85, he's still fighting for it, because he hasn't got it yet. He's still fighting for it. But he knows it's his. And that certainty is what our faith needs to grow into, so that as the decades pass by our lives, we can have that certainty that all I got to do is keep going, keep pressing, keep being faithful. That reward is mine.
It was a continual active obedience. It wasn't, okay, God's promised this. All right, let me sit back because I know God's going to fulfill his promises. And sometimes we may have that attitude where, okay, I know that God's promised this, so let me sit back. No, it was always an active obedience. Sam?
Not just like his personal faith or anything, but I think we all as Christians need exhortation, and we need to be encouraged to continue on to what's to be our goal, should we do the right thing. And things that help that are seeing promises that God has already answered, things that he's already fulfilled. And you see him say that in verse 10. He says, now I see the Lord has let me live as he has said. So this is evidence that he does keep his word. So I think in times where we may be discouraged, we need to remember the promises that we know God has fulfilled. And that should totally encourage us to continue on to the goal and take what he'll offer us when the time is proper.
Yes. We'll talk more about that too with a future question. One of the things that I think we have a hard time with is accepting God's timing. We want things to happen when we want it to happen. And again, just the patience to know that I was ready to go in when I'm 40 years old, and I'm going to have to sit here and wait because of y'all's sinfulness and because of your unbelief, and yet he continues to serve the Lord fully. So I'm reminded of James 5, 7, and 8. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. And then also Hebrews 6, 12 through 15, that you do not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. That's our life. We have to patiently endure. We have to continue to be obedient, and we will receive the promise. Norm?
Also, that part of Caleb's patience was not just in waiting for God, but he had to literally wait for the nation around him to be able to change also. And sometimes we can be patient with God, but boy, it's tough being patient with our brothers and sisters. Who maybe aren't growing, at the speed that maybe we think they ought to, and then we get our pride gets in the way. And so, think about that. The entire 603,552, he had to wait for all them, all that one that followed on to be the kind of people that were going to go in also. There was no guarantee for, they started with 2, but there's no guarantee that what the time frame was going to be.
Yeah, that's a great point, and one that I had not even thought of with thinking about this, but oftentimes when we might be in a situation like this, think about the resentment that we would have toward our brothers or our sisters, and that resentment can cause us, ultimately could cause us to sin, but we're going to have these bad feelings about our brothers or our sisters, and there's no indication. Caleb wholly followed the Lord, and so it sounds like he continued to be the leader. And it's like, look, okay, this is the situation now. We're going to continue to wholly follow the Lord, and he's going to be that example until they get to this point. And so, I think that we can easily do the opposite of what Caleb is doing and have that resentment for our brothers or our sisters, because we could be suffering the consequences of their actions, which we talked about in a prior lesson as well. Anything else on number 5? All right, number 6, consider Joshua 15:63, 16 verse 10, and 17, 12, and 13. What's the problem? Has the narrative shifted from what we read about Caleb and the land he inherited? So let's go ahead and read these. Who are we up to? I forget. Who read last? Bonnie, you read last? All right, so Ken, if you'll do chapter 15, verse 63, and then Sue, if you'll do chapter 16, verse 10, and then Lena, chapter 17, 12, and 13.
Okay, 1563 says, "And as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day."
In 1610, "And they did not drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwell among the Ephraimites to this day and have become forced laborers."
17:12 to 13. "Yet the children of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities, but the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. And it happened, when the children of Israel grew strong, that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly drive them out."
All right, so how's the narrative now shifted between what we just talked about with Caleb? What's the problem?
They're leaving some of the work incomplete.
All right, so they haven't completed the work. Norm?
Seem to be desiring to maybe choose a easier alternative. We're stronger than these guys, so we'll just, instead of driving them out and do what the Lord said, let's just turn them into slaves instead. Not going to work.
All right. Francis?
Earlier in our studies that God had led them to not destroy everyone, so somebody could take care of the things before they were ready to take over.
All right. So in Joshua 17, verse 12, it says, "But the sons of Manasseh could not take possession of these cities because the Canaanites persisted in living in the land." So what should have happened? Well, they should have pushed them out of the land. There seems to be, and we'll see this even with our next question, but there seems to be a little bit of a lack of faith of what's happening. It's like, okay, we've done all this work over the last 5 to 7 years with the work or with the help of the Lord, and I don't know if they're there and they're by themselves. Again, the Lord's with them, but they're not with the whole nation, and so are they having a bit of wavering of their faith and causing them to not go ahead and do what they're told to do and what they should do. But again, whatever the situation is, this is the exact opposite of what we see from Caleb. But this is the same people that, again, over the last 5 to 7 years, they have seen all of the victories that they've been able to have because of the Lord. And they were witnesses to that, and yet here they are just kind of sitting idly by. And to certain degrees, we see even specifically with Joshua's people, complaining about, well, what am I supposed to do? Norm?
This is the danger of compromise. When you can, with compromise, the end result may look like it's a workable solution, but it's not what God said to do. It's compromised because you chose not to do what the Lord told you to do. So now the compromise is, I want to do something that looks like I'm doing it. Saul ran into that problem again later on. We'll find out again. Well, what? I did what the Lord said to do, except for.
Yeah, whether it's a weaker faith or whether it's compromise, they're not doing what the Lord had instructed them to do. Norm P.?
It's also a danger of the major work having been done and not following through with the finish up, which is what this was. The conquest was the major forces of Israel going through and conquering the land as God directed. And the individual tribes were then to clean up in their territories as God commanded. And they didn't. And we can fall into the same trap, and that we will go on and finish a major mission, a major task that's in front of us, something that we know, oh, this has got to get done. But then we will stop as soon as that's done, and all the people that were with us that walk away, and not finish the details that come afterwards that truly complete it as God intended.
I don't want to go against everybody, but I kind of agree with Francis because, and I don't want to dig into your next question, But they come to Joshua and they say, we don't have enough land. Joshua doesn't tell them, well, then go and finish the job, drive them out. He tells them, go and take the wooded land there. Instead of like, well, empty the cities and you'll have enough room. If they really didn't complete the job, then Joshua should have told them that instead of go take another piece of land.
All right, so let's get into our next question. Let's just go ahead and talk about the next question. We'll turn over to Joshua chapter 17. So consider the conversation between Joseph's people and Joshua in Joshua 17, 14 through 18. How does Joshua's response to the sons of Joseph challenge our understanding of problems and solutions, faith and action? What application can we make from this? So let's go ahead and read that. Joshua chapter 17, verse 14. Chip, we'll pick up with you, verse apiece, and then just work our way back.
Then the children of Joseph spoke to Joshua, saying, Why have you given us only one lot and one share to inherit, since we are a great people, inasmuch as the Lord has blessed us until now?
Nate. Verse 15.
Joshua said to them, if you are a numerous people, go up to the forest and clear a place for yourself there in the land of the Perizzites and of the Rephaim, since the whole country of Ephraim is too narrow.
The children of Joseph said, the mountain country is not enough for us, and all the Canaanites who dwell in the land of the valley have chariots of iron, both those who are of Bethshean and its towns, and those who are of the valley of Jezreel.
And Joshua spoke to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, saying, You are a great people and have great power. You shall not have only one lot.
But the mountain country shall be yours, although it is wooded. You shall cut it down, and its farthest extent shall be yours, where you shall drive out the Canaanites, though they have iron chariots and are strong.
All right, so let's just talk about Joshua's response here. So Lena's talked about it just a little bit, but I guess I see the response a little bit differently than what Lena sees it. Norm?
It wasn't an either-or choice. It was, you're supposed to get these guys out. If we get these guys out, we don't have enough land. Okay, then take out those guys also. It was not, that's easy. One's easier than the other, so do that. So it was just a geography kind of thing. They just didn't have enough land, and so go take more land.
Yeah, I mean, so the way I read it, Joshua's response here is for them to take the forest and declare a place, but it actually says there that this is the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, so it's not like this land is empty and it's just trees they're going to have to clear. There are people there that they're going to have to remove. But then in verse 18, he's telling them, no, you're going to take the hill country. It will be yours. Regardless of what the situation is and who the people are, you need to go do it. So the way I read this, Joseph's people are just complaining, and, well, it's almost like we're back before the wandering in the wilderness, and well, look at the people and look how great they are. And Joshua's like, look at you and look at God. Go do it. Why are we having this conversation? And so I think that, again, I think it's that their faith had grown weak, and they were now scared by the people that were around them, and they weren't nearly as strong because of that. And I think that for us, what does complaining say about us? It indicates a lack of faith if we're going to complain. I mean, it had already been laid out before them. They had everything that they needed. The Lord was going to be with them, and yet they're sitting there complaining. And so complaining means, well, I don't trust in God. I mean, that's exactly what they're saying is, well, look at these people. They've got chariots of iron, and we can't do this. Again, just look at the last 5 to 7 years that they had just come through, and now they've got this weak faith again. And so, again, I just see this huge comparison to Caleb, and still it seems like the rest of the people, that their faith is waning again, and we have to be mindful of ourselves. And again, we got to make application to ourselves. We have to be sure that we don't grow weak in our faith and start complaining about difficulties, because we need to remember that God is with us. Norm P?
That last part where they
like he's telling them, they're complaining, they got chariots of iron, go drive them out. Even regardless, it's still I'm not bringing the whole group, this is your job, go drive them out. And it's, again, one of those things of sometimes that last bit actually may be hard, may be tough, but it's still our responsibility to do. We can't just sit back and say, hey, I can't do anything now because it's just me. And you know, that's pick it up, carry through, finish the stroke, finish the work, and you will get that reward. And that was what they had in front of them. Like, these guys are here, they got iron chariots. He says, drive those Canaanites out. You are numerous, you are powerful with the Lord. And if you are with the Lord, it doesn't matter how many chariots they got of iron, they're going to go away.
Finish the work. Francis?
Yeah, iron sinks.
Yeah. Lori?
The Lord tells where they're conquering nations and they're going in, the Lord's telling the people to kill them all or drive them out or kill their animals. And instead of relying on having that faith in the Lord and doing what he says, they rely on their human wisdom or their own personal arrogance. And they're like, oh, we're going to keep the best, we're going to do this. And if they would just have that holy, trusting faith in the Lord and do what he was told, then they would be a lot better off and have the things they needed. So.
Yes. You know, sometimes we talk about blind faith, and sometimes I think that it would be better if we would just close our eyes and realize that God is there, because we open our eyes and we see the things that are in front of us, and we lose sight of how big God is. All right, we got to at least get through this lesson before. All right, number 8, Joshua 20 discussed the cities of refuge. Is there a modern equivalent of the cities of refuge for us today? Francis?
The cities of refuge were for people that were guilty of things, but it was an innocent, it wasn't a planned murder or whatever, it was an accidental. And that was for them to get away from somebody else taking vengeance over them. As far as us having any equivalent cities of refuge, I guess it's the simple fact being you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, and then you have all these avenues to prove yourself.
Okay. Sam?
I didn't raise my hand. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh, Ken. It was Ken that raised his hand.
Well, I was just thinking of the sanctuary cities that are set up in some places where, but they seem to be serving a different purpose than what this was to serve. They are, in my understanding, to give sanctuary to people who are, I don't know, have done wrong, I think.
Yeah, and this is a horribly worded question, I'll admit that. And I do remember a lesson that Andy taught on, I was thinking about that whenever I was looking through Joshua chapter 20. But 2 passages I just want you to think about. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 18, so that by 2 unchangeable things it is impossible for God to lie. You who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. And then Psalm 34:22, the Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. I think there might be a little bit of foreshadowing with Jesus Christ and him being our refuge. Number 9, the key to this section of text and the key to the whole book is found in the final 3 verses of chapter 21. What lessons can we learn from Joshua 21:43 through 35? And we don't have time to read it, but I think that there are a few things. One, the Lord gave them rest. And that's what he had promised them. And he gave them rest on every side, just as he had promised their fathers. And I think that for us, there still remains this offer of rest. Jesus has offered us rest from our labors. Also, we need to notice that not one of the words of the Lord failed, not a single one. Everything that he had promised came to pass. And so we need to know more of God's word so that we can know his promises and use them. Sam kind of alluded to this earlier in the class, but we can use those promises as anchors for our lives, as anchors for our faith, especially whenever we're going through difficult times. If we remember those promises, and we know that God has not ever let one of his promises fail. And then make sure that we are holding on to those promises and using them as our hope. You know, when we grab onto things that are false, oftentimes we may hold on to things that God actually didn't say. And God didn't promise that we were going to have good health. He didn't promise us that we're going to have long life. He didn't promise us that we're going to have wealth. And oftentimes we put our hope in these things that are not promises of God, and it can cause us to lose faith. And so when we grab a hold of those things that really are our false hope, it's going to leave us disappointed. And so we have to make sure that we're holding on to the actual promises that God has given us, and that we can have a faith like Caleb, where we wholly follow the Lord. Thanks, everybody. We will pick up with lesson 4, yet we're officially a lesson behind now. So.